Thanks, Robot Lady. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December 12th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development. Today, we're going to talk about a series of issues. There's lots of things to pack into this call, so I'm going to try and keep my speechifying to a minimum and scheduling as tight as possible. Lots of complexity. I'm going to talk a bit about process. Terrifyingly, that's one of my favorite topics of conversation recently. It feels dead dull, but it's actually fascinating, especially in this context. So let's talk about process for a bit. The second thing we're going to do is hear from LongForWisdom. He gives us a little tour of governance at a glance. This is critically important, and it's going to loop back into the process stuff that I'd like to talk about. But governance is happening right now, and it's happening in our forums. And we have a lot of things that we need to wrap our heads around, and some of those things relate to other things that are happening in the forums. And so it's getting complicated in there. And so we behooves all of us to give some of these threads a deeper look and a brief discussion. So we'll be looking forward to that from LongForWisdom. We have tech representatives. I'm not entirely sure how they should be referred to as a unit, but I'll just call them techs, devs, nerds for now. We have system architects that are in the call. We're going to give us a tour of the mechanics and the implications of the GSM and the OSM. So those are the governance security module and the Oracle security module for the uninitiated. That would be very interesting. We're going to hear about the state of the pegs from Vishesh, and Cyrus is going to give us a brief update about the state of migration. Lots to cram into this call. At the end of the presentations, presumably around the top of the next hour, we will transition into a general Q&A session. So if you have questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to jump on the mic and ask them. If you don't have a microphone or you're shy, type in the chat and we will do our best to flag them and ask them at an appropriate time, or just keep them in your back pocket and save them up for the end of the hour. And then we can start having more of a free-form Q&A session. Okay, so in the interest of time, I am going to jump into things. And I threatened to talk about process, and I'm going to do it. So the last, I don't even know how many meetings, 6 meetings possibly. The recurring theme of my segment has been discussion about governance and what it means, what the base assumptions are, how it works, and how we can start thinking about it a bit more deeply than we have been. So I'm going to do a little recap for people that may have forgotten. It's my contention that the governance system that we had that valiantly got us through single collateral DAI that we all worked on together, that we iterated on and helped us to launch MCD was great. And it was a very inspiring experiment in organization and open governance. And it's served us well, but it's my contention that it will not serve us in the future. And I think that at the risk of pointing out how often I'm right about these things, it already hasn't. It's already starting to show its cracks. So here's the situation. We have 2 universes right now. We have single collateral DAI, we have multi-collateral DAI. So 2 different pegs, 2 different economies, depending on how finely you want to split those 2 things apart. In the single collateral world, we have a lever, and that lever is the stability fee. In the multi-collateral world, I'm not sure that we even have a clear understanding of how many levers we're going to end up with there, but we have a lot of them already. We have debt ceilings, we have stability fees, we have DSRs, we have, why am I blanking on some of the obvious stuff? Maybe David will type in the chat for me. Anyways, we have lots of levers, more levers are coming. So levers are great. That gives the community an opportunity to finally tune what it is that we do and how to manage the monetary policy that we are responsible for maintaining. The problem is that that's easier said than done. There's a lot that goes on in the course of a week. It's impossible to predict what those things might be. We need to retain some sort of agility. We need to present a universe or a world or an ecosystem that there's a reasonable expectation that people will be able to keep up and make informed decisions and understand what it is that they're voting on. That's going to be a huge challenge. And we've seen those challenges right out of the gate because this is a nascent ecosystem. We've had to deploy fixes and or improvements. Those fixes and improvements getting bundled together with stability fee adjustments or DSR adjustments or whatever other adjustments that might be laying around or ready to go is pretty complicated to have this one executive at the end of the week that's a roll-up of various issues. We also have emerging changes, things that are on the roadmap but might be pushed up or unplanned, and we're talking about one of those today in depth, and that's the GSM. So what do we do? How do we remain responsive? How do we understand what it is the community wants? How do we understand how do we communicate the things that are important and relevant to these emerging issues in a timely manner that allows us to maintain this weekly cadence? Because things happen on a weekend. We need to come up with contingencies on a Monday and Tuesday. We need to get a poll into the forums on a Wednesday, and then we need to have a call on a Thursday, and then we need to vote on all of it on Friday. That's not a lot of buffer there. So I want to loop all those problems back to a potential pathway to solutions. And I've been talking about this over and over and over again, but the last couple of weeks I talked about creating a working group in formalizing a working group that could help guide the path into version 2 of governance. So this represents a little bit of an evolution or an increase in sophistication, which I think follows a very clear path of iterative improvements. Maybe I'll spare everybody the long timeline that got us from where we were at the very beginning to where we are now. But at the very beginning, we were people talking in a room, or actually in the very beginning. Well, we can go all the way back. There wasn't even video when people started talking about this stuff. It was TeamSpeak. But we're at a process now where we have deeply engaged stakeholders. We have forums. We have repos. We have some emerging process that's been established. We have people that are highly engaged stakeholders that are doing work to support the governance ecosystem. I would like to take the next step in that process and treat what it is that we do as being kind of like a real grown-up business with project plans and ticket trackers and Kanban boards and all the rest. Like that's a process that's going to be coming down the line. But the first step, though, is to ensure that we can collect the ideas and the improvements and the requirements that the community has for the governance system, and ensure that there is a very clear bridge built between the foundation and the DAO and the ecosystem, that these teams can work together. And how I would like to do that is through my manifesto that I've been working on for weeks, to post that in the forums, outlining the problem statements. Basically, here's a list of issues that I think that the community could get started on, or at least begin to discuss. And I'll spare people the full list, because last time I realized it took me like 5 minutes to get through the things that were at the top of my mind. But things like incentivization and scheduling, how do we deal with weak executives? How do we communicate? How do we what cadence is effective for us? How do we get empirical evidence that validates our actions in the past? There's all these questions. Once we identify those, have some discussions about which ones are most important, do some prioritization and scoping, start breaking off into teams or a team, and formally start plugging away at these problems and seeing what shakes out of that and how process can come into play. There will be funding available from the Community Development Grants Program to help incentivize activity here. So if there's engaged stakeholders that have time and the inclination and the ability to commit to this process, then please join us in the governance, or in the governance forums, and we'll get something formalized. But all right, so that was a bit of a recap. So here's why I'm very interested in this kind of thing. Let's use this week as an example. We had on our loose, very short-term roadmap this week, we were going to finish up the transfer of authority of the maker token to the community. There was things, developments, communications, meetings, chats, posts that we're all going to do that. The weekend, we found out that we needed to change midstream. I can't remember the metaphor there. We had to switch into a new path, and that new path involved rapidly allowing for the possibility that the community would choose to implement the GSM. So that means that we had a plan, we had to switch that plan into the GSM plan, we had to put a poll out there that allowed the community to make their own decisions about this, and then we had to, in the back office, ensure that these mechanisms and things were audited and verified and deployed and tested and staged and all the rest of those things that the developers in the call will be intimately familiar with. And then while that was happening, we had other discussions occurring in the forum, and some discussions like, well, why would we only do 24? I mean, we should do 7 days on a GSM delay. And then other discussions started about, well, maybe we shouldn't be talking about monetary policy at all this week. Maybe we should just focus on the GSM thing. And then there was an addendum in the forums about, I'll let Wouter get into this more deeply in a second, about how for the GSM to be effective or less damaging at this early stage, perhaps the OSM should be excluded from that. And so that raises issues where let's wrap all this stuff in a bow. What do we do now? That's the question I have. Does that mean that we don't do monetary policy? Did we decide that? How did we decide it? Is that forum post enough of a decision to the poll? Is that enough of a decision to delay monetary policy this week? Did we decide that the GSM is going out only if it concludes the OSM, or is it the GSM and OSM is nice to have? Or if the OSM is not ready, do we do GSM on the weekend? And if we do it on the weekend, does that mean that we go ahead with our monetary policy, or do we wait till the GSM OSM has been ratified over the weekend and then immediately launch into the previous week's monetary policy, or do we skip it and then move on to the next cadence? All right, so obviously I can sense people rolling their eyes, so I'll leave it there. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is that we're doing a lot of complicated things. There's lots of moving pieces here, and we're getting to the point where there has to be process. We have to establish some firm process here. And that what I would like for people to offer up some suggestions or start giving us some thoughts is what short-term versus long-term process might look like. But here's the things that I'm thinking about this week. How do we tighten up the process that we already have that's emerged in the forums? How do we make that process canonical? How do we ensure that we have wide-ranging buy-in to that process and that people are aware that that process exists? How do we formulate these proposals? How do we initiate them? Like we've been through all of these things, but that hasn't been made canonical. And I keep on tossing around that word, but where do proposals come from? How do we make them? And this is people's eyes are going to roll right out of their heads, but how do we reach consensus? It seems like a silly question, but I think that we need to have a very clear understanding of what that means, because if the community wants general consensus, rough consensus, and then best faith effort to just act based on rough consensus, that's one thing. If the community demands that we have a very clear signaling process with very clear next steps, that's another thing. And we need to figure out where in that spectrum the community lands, and how to, actually, I'm about to wrap up my last one list, and you can jump in, David. Okay. And the final thing that I'd like to figure out sooner rather than later is how do we figure out scheduling? Because scheduling and calendaring is a major, boring, but hyper important question. How do we figure out what happens when, and what amount of time needs to be spent on each one of these stages of consensus and proposal making and forum posts and calls and weekly cadences? And we have to balance our commitment to this strategy or this process versus our requirements for being agile. And so once we have this first kick at the can of like, what is a proposal, what is consensus, what is scheduling, what is communication, we can start coming up with our commitments to each one of these things and start thinking about edge cases, and then when do we start exiting that process and under what pressures. So there are a fantastic amount of things that we need to figure out. One is, what does governance do? And the second or maybe the one before it. Who knows what the order of operations is here? But and the other question is, how do we do it? And those things need to be very, very clearly defined. Ideally, before we get out of the migration step, because we're not really into the weeds yet. We're just in our first foray, and we were already running into a lot of complexities in this governance ecosystem. So that was me with my big speechifying. I am going to probably stop it there. There's literally no group chats right now. Oh, there is. David, is there anything in there that needs to be addressed?
Well, to be honest, I haven't read Aaron's bigger comment up top, but I don't think so.
Aaron, do you have access to a mic, and or would you like to ask a question? Aaron says nope, I think. Okay, David, did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if you wanted to talk about the topic of consensus and what it means here in this preamble, or if you want to leave it for like discussion after the call for later, so we don't have to put down the time.
Yeah, actually, keep it at the top of your mind, because this is, I think that consensus. Yeah, we could definitely talk about it for an hour. I could talk about it for an hour, and nobody else would be a chance to get a word in edgewise. But let's pick it up at the top of the Q&A session and dig into it, because it's fascinating. But we really need to crank through the GSM OSM stuff and the risk stuff.
All right, cool.
LongForWisdom, I actually want to kick it off to you before we get into the tech stuff, because some of the signaling that you've been nurturing in that forum of ours could potentially color some of the conversations we're having toward the end of the call. You want to take over?
Yeah, sure. Cool. Okay, so there've been like 4 signaling threads come up this week. There's also been one discussion though, so I'll cover that first. So IMEO posted a sort of fairly lengthy post on questions and discussions he had about emergency shutdown, which were pretty interesting and sort of get into a bit more of the game theory and sort of the incentives behind emergency shutdown and what makes it good and what makes it less good. So anyone who's sort of interested in that in more detail, I'd suggest that. So then we've got the signaling threads. So the first one was one posted by Hexanaut discussing the format of the DSR poll in the weekly polls. So Hexanaut was proposing that instead of voting for DSR as an absolute value, we would vote for it as a relative value. So it's the DSR spread from the stability fee. So what that would mean is if this DSR spread was set to 0%, then it would be the same as the stability fee. So if the stability fee was 4%, the DSR would also be 4%. Oh God.
Just to jump in there, I think
I
think the idea was more that not that the DSR should be a function of the stability fee, but that the stability fee should be a function of the DSR.
Yeah, possibly. I'm not entirely sure which way around he was proposing. I think it was. Yeah, there was voting. It was voting basically of the spread, wasn't it? So maybe it was the other way around. I'm not sure.
Yeah, basically you would still be voting on the single collateral die stability fee and then the multi collateral die stability fees, and then instead of a DSR a question of the exact rate, you would just vote on the spread, and based on the combination of like what fees were voted on plus the spread, it would give you a DSR value, something like that.
Right.
I think I'm messing that up though.
I thought that was my understanding as well. I think. Anyway, so that was interesting, and is a cool thing to go signal on. Lots of reasons to consider why it's better to consider the DSR as a spread rather than as a separate arbitrary value, because they are kind of cool. So the next signaling thread was another signal request poll over when we should trigger SCD global shutdown, which was done by Aaron, who I think is in the call. Aaron, did you want to talk about that at all, or are you good? Okay, busy. No, it's fine.
By the way, that poll actually you could vote on multiple options, so it's not like a one option poll.
Yes.
Just a heads up on that.
Yes, sometimes that's not obvious, but yes. Yeah, so this was a sort of just a discussion of when we should consider starting or consider triggering STD global shutdown, whether we should do it based on a specific date, whether we should do it based on a certain supply being reached, or whether it should be based on like the deviation in the peg. Personally, I think like all of those are valid reasons to, like potentially reasons to do it. It would depend on the circumstances. But there's some discussion in there and some pros and cons of each one.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what the internal risk team's thoughts on that are, because I know that both the time and the SCD supply were both like kind of the biggest factors in the risk for end users.
Yeah,
Especially the
I mean,
supply.
there's a bunch of different factors. I haven't checked out that thread yet, so I don't want to maybe dive too deep into it right now, but certainly we can pick this up at the end of the call.
Yeah, that's fine. I can carry on. Cool. So then getting on into the governance security module related threads. The first one I'm going to mention is the addendum to the current poll that Rich posted and is mentioned in his thing. So this was the discussion of whether we should exclude, sorry, the Oracle security module from the governance security delay, which seems like most people are in favor of, and that would be beneficial. But yeah, read through the description of why that's important, or possibly just listen to Wouter later. We'll find out why. So the last one then was the thread I created, which was discussing whether, in the case where we have an emergency or urgent technical change to the DCS, then should we skip monetary policy changes in executive vote to avoid bundling required changes with other potentially not required changes?
I'm actually super interested in this one because this is a perfect test case to figure out, or at least start talking about these issues about how do we make decisions and what is consensus and scheduling. And all of those problems that I listed at the beginning are encapsulated in your post, LongForWisdom. So,
yeah.
Troublemaker. So give us an idea of what your thoughts are here. How do we even frame this properly? So the general cadence is we do monetary policy on Monday. This when there's other proposals or polls that come along, those get bundled up into the weekly governance cycle. Then on Friday we have an executive and we vote on all of those. The first sort of right out of the gate, we had a cadence where there was something that was kind of classified as a fix. Yeah, this is where everything, you know me, I just have nothing but questions. What's the difference between a fix and an upgrade, and what is just a new lever being exposed, and whether those things are mutually exclusive, and whether we just pump the brakes immediately if something outside of the normal cadence comes along? Those are all questions that I'm very hazy on, and I'm desperate that the community come back with a clear signal that would let us know the way that we're supposed to proceed. But in your perspective, based on the feedback in that thread and the processes that we've established in the forums and prior art we have in this type of situation, is it the expectation that we will not have monetary policy votes this week? We'll focus exclusively on the GSM/OSM thing.
I don't know. I don't know if that's the expectation. I don't know if that's the expectation or not. Like, so the reason I put this up is because we kind of discussed this last time with the I forget which change it was, but the other technical change we had to do the other day.
The flopper. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. And we sort of just like in general, that's the consensus on that signaling thread was that ideally we want to separate monetary policy from engineering changes. And then considering now that we've got like an emergency engineering change, it seemed to make sense to at least see what people thought about separating that.
Can you remind us what people thought about it? How'd the vote shake?
For the fluffer or for the current one?
For the current one.
For the current one, 19 voters, 58% think that we should not include monetary policy changes in the week's executive in the case of any emergency, and then 11%, which is 2 people, think that we should only skip it for this emergency. So 11 people in favor.
So where does that leave us, though? Like, have we established, is that consensus? Does that mean that, okay, that it's decided we don't do monetary policy this week?
I don't know. That's your job. You're the facilitator.
Well,
Dude,
so
everybody
hold on.
knows that I actually work for you, man. It's becoming increasingly
hold on.
obvious.
To frame this a little bit, right? Like, does this mean now that it would make more sense if we had a bi-weekly monetary policy cadence, and then in the weeks that we aren't doing monetary policy, that's when we should be focusing on things like MIPS, upgrades, style changes, process changes, all of these things, right? Like,
I
does
don't think
that
it's going to be possible to predict that
Potentially, yeah.
we're going to need every second week for things that aren't monetary policy. Like there's extremely important conversation to be had about the efficacy of our existing cadences and whether there's any
Exactly.
evidence to show that that has happened. But I'd like to decouple those things. I'm not saying that like we're going to a bi-weekly cadence just in case there's something we need to do every second week, right? It needs to be driven by data and evidence that whatever we're doing is the most effective path.
The system is too new to, in my opinion, start saying we're only going to do it every other week.
right?
Yeah, I agree. But I don't want to lose this thread though, so let's try and see whether we can get some community consensus here. And I'm not going to let you off the hook, LongForWisdom. You started
Alright.
this mess with your
Alright,
forum
alright.
post. So
I'll try and okay. So if I hadn't posted this forum post, right, then we would have, then presumably they'd be bundled and everyone would be, well, I would be dissatisfied. I suspect some other people would have been dissatisfied as well.
Mhm.
By putting this out, we have some idea that what appears to be a reasonably large group of people think that we should not bundle them. Whether we need to do an on-chain poll to confirm that, I don't know. Like,
yeah,
if
well,
we
that's the
had-
problem, right? That's where
Yeah,
scheduling
so-
and cadence comes in, because then
Yeah.
when are we ever going to do anything if we need to wait a week and another week and then a poll
Yeah.
week and then an executive week, right?
Yeah. So the difficulty in this case is that there's no real, like, there's no time to do it before this executive, right? So
Mm-hmm.
So arguably we should, I mean, yeah, like ideally we would have an on-chain poll after this to confirm that token holders agreed with the forum, with what seemed to come up on the forum. But in the case where we have a limited amount of time, then it's open to like interpretation. Like, should we like take this as consensus, or should we say we're gonna ignore this and just do it anyway because we don't have on-chain confirmation?
Yeah, there's some very, very important conversations to be had here, because let's look at some of the base assumptions of the world that we live in. We have continuous approval voting. That's skin in the game voting. People with potentially the most to lose, most of the gain, presumably are the deepest watchers and maintainers of this ecosystem, and that's what we've designed. That's what everybody signed up for. We need to internalize that and understand that this is a plutocracy, because presumably these plutarchs are extremely interested in the success of this ecosystem. We have a polling system that allows a wider range of people to engage in a signaling process in the forums that ideally allows the ecosystem to know what moves into an executive, but also to set some cultural norms or establish principles or ratify things that aren't technically code-based. So that's hyper important as well. We also, because we needed some additional flexibility, we also needed some way to signal the signalers. So we got a bit recursive on this thing, and it was the community determined that in order to figure out what goes into a poll, we need to talk about things, and then we need to, if we're talking about things and having debates, we need to figure out what the result of those debates were. So in the forums, we have proposals going to the forums, and then there's a forum poll, and then after a certain amount of time and deliberation, consensus is reached on that forum poll, which is more of an extremely non-Sybil resistant form of representative democracy, where people just can make their voices heard, and based on that, it goes into the portal for a portal poll, and then the portal poll to the executive. So it's this very beginning, this is the very first step that we have right now of the proposal in the portal, and the poll is very, I don't think it's clearly defined enough, and what our expectations are from that activity in the forum, and responsibility and ownership of events that get kicked off there are still not defined as well as I'd like. So that's where I'm talking about process. So LongForWisdom posted that thread. What was it during the last? I can't remember when you did it. I think it was during the last call. No, it was Monday. Tuesday.
3 days ago.
Yeah. About hey, we've already talked about this kind of thing. Based on prior history, we don't bundle something that could conceivably be considered a technical fix with a monetary policy fix. So therefore, let's have a chat. my concern is that this feels like the process is decoupled a bit. So I don't know how to. All right, here, let me break it down. It's my job to figure out what the community wants to do, and then do a bunch of administration and copying and pasting and form submissions to make sure that their will is represented in the portal. And so my job tomorrow is to figure out what it is the community wanted to do. And that's right now, it's a confusing proposition for me because I don't know. So I need to know whether we're doing monetary policy or not, or whether we're doing monetary and GSM, or whether we're doing monetary GSM and OSM, or some combination of those things, and when, I guess, is my problem.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't really have an answer. Like the aim for the poll was to show that like some people, or at least, well, hopefully show that some people didn't want to bundle them, which seems to be the case. The question is whether you think that's enough to not bundle them, or whether we always need a governance poll for stuff like this.
Well, I think, yeah, it's obvious that I'm terrified of making judgment calls in this world. I don't want to. I want the interim governance facilitator to be completely administrative, and maybe if issue hits the fan, then we can like start making uncomfortable decisions, I guess. But I really don't want to be being put in a position where like, okay, everybody, I've just based on how I've interpreted what's going on in the forums, this is what the world looks like today or this week. It's
Well,
hyper risky.
The thing is, all right, so if this one wasn't posted, presumably these people would still feel the same way, but we just have less information. So by having the poll, we have more information than we did to start with. We don't have all the information that we get from like an on-chain governance poll, but we have more than 0. So in my view, we should like look at the majority of the poll and then follow that. But again, I can see if some people disagree with that. So yeah, it's
I see many even typing some stuff on the side there. Do you have input?
More just that I think we should treat the forum polls as a type of signaling for an actual governance poll. And aside from that, we can't really like say anything about the community's will, I think, unless at least a governance poll has been put out and concluded. And then obviously, even those are just sort of us adhering to sort of a code of ethics. The system that actually has an impact is the executive vote. So, yeah.
So then this is where it comes down to what kind of latitude, what's the signaling, what's the thresholding for debates and all the rest of it. And if we adhere to that, then then what would have to happen is that we're having monetary policy and the GSM thing this week because no decisions can be made outside of a governance poll, right? So.
Yeah, which is a bummer because I also don't want to bundle monetary and technical changes. So, because I think it's a dangerous type of pork barrel politics. Like we all need the technical changes, and that makes it so we are forced to vote on monetary policy changes that we may not want. So,
the other thing that I agree completely. Well, sure, yeah, I'll just admit that I agree. All right, so the other thing that concerns me too is that from this perspective, what are we saying about our monetary policy decisions? Like. If it's let's just not do it. Like, if we can say let's just not do it, why are we doing it in the first place? Like, if it's not that important, what's the situation?
I think the difference between making monetary policy changes week over week versus every once in a while skipping a week for other needed changes is not a big deal, especially considering the fact that we don't even have a grasp on the efficacy of these changes. Like you don't know if it actually might be a good thing to wait 2 weeks instead of a week. And then there's also the other part where if it's like an obvious emergency where you need a monetary policy change in order to like remedy something like a very clear weak peg, then it's a matter of measuring the priority week to week. But I think that bundling them is just a risk of us taking even longer to do the changes that we need to do because they might conflict and basically cause us to lose a week.
So can I make a quick point regarding like the whole on-chain governance poll and like maker as law thing that's kind of been discussed?
Okay.
So like obviously I agree, like in an ideal situation, we would have the governance poll, we'd find out what token holders think and then do that. But I will say in this case, we're not actively going against. So it's not that we're going against like what maker token holders think here based on the forum poll. Like we haven't had any on-chain poll related to like bundling. Like at no point have maker holders said, yes, we want to bundle like monetary policies changes with like emergency technical changes. So again, what we have here is some preliminary information that might indicate that they don't want that. And while we can't confirm it in time for like this week, you know, we have some information where previously we had none.
All right, well, that's interesting. So maybe that's, yeah, I think you might have clarified something for me. So the problem is that we came up with some potential use or whatever, a process with the flopper thing, but we didn't adequately follow up on it. So the community sort of signaled, presumably, that these two things shouldn't be bundled, but we didn't formalize that as being a thing. So maybe that's the next step, like coming up with some mechanism, some procedure that's like, in the course of a week, if it turns out that there's some kind of emergency fix for that week, the procedure now is to delay the monetary policy, which will be pushed off to the next week. And then we can just assume that that's the precedent, and then I don't need to be paralyzed by indecision.
Yeah, I mean, I think
and then that goes into a poll where everybody actually formally signaled for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think after like next week or the week after or something or whenever, like we have the governance poll to confirm that this is what people want. The question is more like what we do this week, because this is the week where it's like happening, right?
Yeah, well,
so
presumably next week there won't be an emergency.
Is what Aaron is saying true? Did all the polls end up so that there's no monetary policy change this week? We just land in a happy accident where we don't have to discuss this.
This happened last time as well.
Actually,
yeah, so.
All right, well, maybe that's something to dig into. And maybe that's a good place to leave it then. So obviously there's no end of these discussions that need to be had, but I'm happy that we had this discussion that just surfaced some of these things that they need to be figured out. And so this working group needs to happen. We need to formalize it. People that are interested in this kind of thing, we need to make sure that those words are captured in a forum thread. And then after those words have been captured, they go into a document. After they're in that document, they go into GitHub. And once they're in GitHub, they become canonical. And then everybody knows exactly what's happening. But we need to formalize that process, or else it's just people talking in circles. So. All right, with that inspiring summary, I am going to hand it off to you, Wouter, I believe, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, sure. So what I will do is I'll try to summarize the question basically that we need to solve for this week after the events of this week, and give an update on the work that the smart contracts team has been doing. So yeah, and presumably leading up to an executive vote tomorrow, but we can discuss that. So first, to summarize, this is really what is in the forum post. I'll recap anyway because I think it's important. So on Monday there was a blog post by Mika Zoltu, who pointed out the mechanism of governance attacks in the Maker system. And this was information that wasn't as widely known as the reach of the blog post, so it caused quite some waves in the community, and it really focused attention on the question of the delay of the governance security module, which is one of the components that we have deployed together with the initial MCD deployment. Now, the governance security module delay is designed to defend against these kind of governance attacks. And a governance attack is the exact same mechanism as a governance vote, except that the proposal that is voted in is malicious to the system. And what the governance security module does, it creates a delay between the moment when the executive vote is lifted, so when it actually passes the vote, and the moment when the change is actually applied to the system. So if a vote passes today 6 p.m., then if there is a delay of 24 hours, then the change would be applied tomorrow 6 p.m. And yeah, this is the case for any governance changes, whether it be simple parameter updates or risk parameter updates and so on. It's also the case for far-reaching upgrades of the system, for example, updates of the modules in the system. Now, there are also downsides to setting. Yeah. So what do you get with the delay? The delay gives the opportunity to the community to inspect the upcoming changes. So you can have a look in your block explorer. You can inspect the code that has been voted in through the executive vote, and you can inspect the effects that it will have on the system. And you can determine if the change is malicious or not. And then if it is malicious, then there are typically two reactions that can happen. One is that the community can do a second executive vote, which cancels the outstanding change within, if they do that within 24 hours, the change will be canceled without effect. If that's not possible because somehow the attacker got the proposal in the system, so it might be that they hold the majority of MKR, or it's not possible to gather the community in time, then there is still the option of triggering emergency shutdown through the emergency shutdown module, which is a minority defense mechanism. If you have 50,000 MKR, in the process you will burn your MKR, but if that's is that the price that you want to pay for it, then you can trigger immediately emergency shutdown of the entire system, which would wind down the entire system, so giving back DAI holders an equivalent amount of collateral, and allowing CDP holders to withdraw their collateral that isn't that they haven't taken that out against. So so it's described like this, it seems like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you enable the delay right away? But it's important to realize that this is really a trade-off with advantages and disadvantages. So the downside of the delay is that the delay applies to all governance changes, not just the malicious one, because if we could discriminate between malicious changes and honest ones, then we could just as well cancel them right away. But precisely because we can't, there's no objective way of doing that other than through the judgment of the MKR holders, we need to have honest proposals as well go through this delay. Now, this is maybe problematic for changes of risk parameters and so on. Some of those, maybe you don't want to wait 24 hours, but that's probably not the worst problem. The trickiest part is that emergency patches. So if there is a critical vulnerability detected in the system, then the way that a patch is deployed is through the same process. So you also need to vote in the patch. And so if there is a delay of 24 hours, well, the patch will sit there and the community will be able to examine that patch, just like they can examine any change that will be applied to the system. And then they will see what the patch will fix. And of course, that will point to the vulnerability, which they will be able to exploit as soon as they figure out what the patch actually does until the 24 hours are over. So that's kind of a, so the summary there is a short delay helps us because we can actually fix things without pointing to the vulnerability first, without telegraphing the vulnerability first to the community for 24 hours. But on the other hand, the same goes for governance attacks. So if we have a delay, then we are better defended against governance attacks. This whole discussion has unfolded on Twitter and on social media, and also in our forums. Ultimately, what we did is we put up a proposal that we believe would be a good short-term technical solution and a good compromise between the people who are concerned about the governance attacks, yet still minimize the negative effects it would have on our agility to fix problems in the system. So the solution that we put forward is to indeed increase the delay to 24 hours, but that we build in an exception. And the exception would be that the Oracle security module, which is another module in the system with a delay, that one would be excluded from the governance security module delay. And the reason is that the oracle. So when new prices are fed into the system, then there is a 1 hour delay, quite similar to the governance security module delay. There is a 1 hour delay before the price gets applied. So we can then freeze the Oracle security module if we see that the price is being manipulated. So that's a delay of 1 hour that we have. You can't really increase that delay because obviously the market price needs to get into the system in a reasonable amount of time, and 1 hour seems to be just acceptable. So the issue there is if the Oracle security module would be subject to the governance security module, then that would mean that we can't freeze a price without waiting 24 hours, and that effectively disables the security mechanism of that OSM. So and this is a fairly simple technical solution that the team has been examining and reviewing for security issues the last week. And we're progressing well. We'll be able to put up the vote indeed tomorrow to have an executive vote and apply this change to set the delay to 24 hours, excluding the Oracle security module freeze method. The only thing that the team has come up with, so technically speaking, there are two ways of freezing the Oracle price feed. One way is to literally freeze the price, as in if the current price is 400 and there is a malicious price coming in, then you just freeze the 400 and it remains 400 until there is a governance vote, which would be subject to the governance security module delay to unfreeze the Oracle the Oracle system. The other way of freezing prices is slightly different. It disables the Oracle security module, and it would then also make drawing that and triggering emergency shutdown impossible. That is another function that could be useful in other situations, but the risk analysis that we did showed that it is better to just freeze the price. And the reason is that this wouldn't block emergency shutdown. And we can't block emergency shutdown because if we were, then the governance attack would still be possible, whereby the attacker uses whatever mechanism they have, they trigger the Oracle security module, and then they would effectively disable the defense against that, which is the emergency shutdown. So conclusion, the team analyzed these two methods, the stop method, which literally freezes the price without further additional effects, versus the void method, which would really disable the Oracle security module, but also emergency shutdown. And the right technical solutions to go for the stop method. And this is where we are today. And we are ready to put this up to an executive vote tomorrow. And here I'll pause and see if there are questions. I see quite a lot of activity in chats.
I was keeping up with it, Wouter, while you're going.
So what are the questions that pop up?
Just some discussions about the basically that bug fixes would be exposed, and little discussions about the fixes for the LSM.
Yeah, so one that I see here, can the Oracle governance security module be switched off to allow honest fixes? Yes, that's possible.
I mean, but it has to go through the delay. So it is possible to disable it, but disabling itself obviously would have to go to the delay first. So that the first change would be to disable it, and then once it is disabled, then you can apply bug fixes without delay again. But in reality, that would be very hard to do, because you would need, let's say, someone to tell the community, hey, you know what, why don't you just trust us? We found a critical vulnerability and we want to submit a patch to the system.
It also opens a 24 to 48 hour window for anybody who might have been just holding one in reserve to try and squeeze something through, right?
That's right. I consider that a secondary consideration, but yeah, sure, that too. Also, obviously, once you ask for disabling the delay, then you're also drawing attention to the fact that there is a vulnerability to be found in the system.
Yeah, just not specifically where it is.
Not
Yeah.
specifically what it
But
is. Yeah.
You give
Whereas
people 24 hours with enough economic incentive, you know.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So what would be the solution in that case? Like freezing and then like freezing the entire system to do the.
Yeah, it's
would there be any benefit GSM time delay the 24-hour period at the point at which? I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead.
Can you hear us?
I'm not sure if I'm on. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so incrementally getting us eventually to the 24-hour point at the point where the dev team originally thought we would get to it, which would probably be in a month or two, from my understanding.
Yeah. Okay. So those were two questions. I'll take them one by one. So the first question was, what can we do if the delay is enabled, and for example, it's 24 hours, and we need to apply a critical patch? Well, it really becomes a matter of creative solutions at that point. So one thing that has been done in crypto before is some vulnerabilities are such that you can actually exploit them yourself, and that you can, if a good actor does that, then the attack can be avoided because it is actually executed by a good actor, and like people are given their collateral or money or whatever that you would be able to steal back. Then there are a number of solutions that really depend on the context. Maybe it's possible to structure the patch in a way, or make sure that the like, for example, if you can coordinate with MKR holders, there are certain things you can do. For example, you could first change a certain parameter. You could say, for example, it really depends on the situation, right? But I can imagine like a situation where you could say, we'll need to ask the community to set the debt ceiling to 0. We can't say why yet, but we need to set the debt ceiling to 0 and temporarily stop the drawing more debt because there is a vulnerability. So in other words, it's quite close to just submitting a patch, but it's rather creating the situation where where the vulnerability would no longer be active, without, once again, being specific enough to point people to the actual vulnerability. Now, if these kind of creative solutions don't work, then ultimately the last measure of defense is to trigger emergency shutdown through the emergency shutdown module, so with the 50K MKR. And then you migrate the system to a new version which has the critical vulnerability patched. So, and obviously, it's definitely a solution, but it's a painful process to go through, and that's the reason why we started with a delay of 0, because the basic risk analysis is that when you put a new system in operation, MCD and also Oracle's V2, then the chances of a technical issue are relatively high, and those chances diminish quite quickly over time, whereas the governance attack probability remains quite constant until someone goes out and posts an article on CoinDesk, and then it increases a bit, and then you need to then you need to reevaluate your risk assessment. So and that's exactly what happened, right? So the delay was 0. We were seeing that the system was operating technically in the way that we were expecting, so that was good. But then the probability of a governance attack due to the attention that was drawn to it increased, and then it was our assessment that since we were already now about a month in MCD launch, that it's probably with the increased probability of a governance attack, and given that we can remove that one disadvantage that we definitely want to avoid, which is the OSM being blocked, that is the optimal mix really to proceed. And then to come back to Chris's question, would it be beneficial to build up the delay? Yeah. Well, the thing is, as we mentioned, suppose that we do find a critical vulnerability, and we can't have it known for 24 hours before a patch is deployed. This is probably the best solution, and actually we've not mentioned it yet. Instead of saying, "Hey, community, trust us, put the delay to 0," you can probably find, depending on the issue, you can find a window that would make it possible for the community to process what the vulnerability is, and to verify that the patch is reasonable and fixes the vulnerability, but not enough to write and use an exploit. So, and I think building up the delay systematically over the coming weeks wouldn't have a lot of advantages above that approach. So rather than changing it, I would say 24 hours seems like a good starting point. We'll be able to still apply the routine changes within a reasonable time. There will be enough time to scrutinize all the changes that will be applied to the system. And if we do detect a critical vulnerability and we need to apply a patch, then we can still say, hey, you know what, let's decrease the delay and put it at half an hour, for example, and we'll explain to you in half an hour what the vulnerability is and what the patch is. And if you're not convinced, then you can pull the trigger. But a half an hour wouldn't be enough time for someone to use the exploit. So it really depends on what kind of vulnerability we're talking about. But does that answer your question?
Yes, and I think I might have missed something in this conversation. I might have cut out. But how would you override the 24-hour delay in order to change it to 30 minutes? Like,
that's something you need to ask. Yeah, that is a regular governance change. So you need to put that through an executive vote. So that change would be subject to the initial 24-hour delay. So you put up an executive vote that says decrease the delay to 30 minutes. That one is passed. It takes 24 hours before the change is applied. Now the delay is 30 minutes. Now it's time to submit the patch, have a lightning discussion with the community, and and then activate the patch of the critical vulnerability.
So that vote would happen without you guys revealing the vulnerability or the problem to the community. It would just be, we found something bad, trust us, you want this reduced to 30 minutes. The community has to then trust you and vote to change it to 30 minutes, and then you're going to reveal what's actually going on. Okay,
that's right.
So,
and the idea
that sounds like a move away from a decentralized structure, right? I mean, that's definitely the wrong direction if we want to move towards a decentralized governance.
I think
it's an interesting conversation to have, though, because decentralized governance, decentralized. First, I'm going to do it again. So prepare your eye rolling.
Can I just make a point before you go, Rich? So I think it's still decentralized because the half-hour delay would still be there to cancel the change if we cannot convince the community in half an hour that this is indeed a reasonable change. And half an hour is hypothetical, right? It depends on the vulnerability. Maybe it's a vulnerability that you cannot exploit in an hour, so we can just about take an hour to explain everything show that indeed the patch does what the patch is supposed to do. So it's rather the opposite way around. Like the decentralization works through giving the ability to the community to block a certain action. And that is, I think, a pattern that we'll see more and more in the future. In fact, we've mentioned instant access modules quite a lot. And we haven't shared all the designs yet, but some of these designs are based on the same principle. It's a certain action that goes through by default, and it doesn't need a lot of cooperation from the community, but the community has the power to cancel, to block that action if they want to. So it's kind of the reasoning the other way around, but it is also a form of decentralization. So yeah, sorry, Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to take that opportunity to do some level setting here, though, because decentralization is a loaded term, and it's important that we understand what we're talking about when we say decentralization, because it's my position that there's no such thing. It's a spectrum. So you either move close to full decentralization or you move away from decentralization. The fact that we're here talking about things to do means that we're not completely decentralized. It's the people that are voting, the people that are in the call, the people that are reading the forums are making decisions, right? So we need to understand whether we're moving away from decentralization or towards it, and figure out what it is we're willing to accept along that path.
I should have used the term trustless.
There you go. That's a good one.
Trustless
Yeah.
is a better.
Yeah, I love that
word
one, actually, because you can actually point to that one. And there's various levels of trust that we can consider. And I was going to wow everybody with my insight, but apparently it's already been talked about in the sidebar. So there's another model where you could have a team of trusted actors in the ecosystem that are basically the MakerDAO security team, and it's their job to be to vet security changes on behalf of the ecosystem, so that the foundation can say, okay, guys, we have a situation here. Let's get into a call. Everybody sign an NDA. This is what we're up against. Do you, on behalf of the community, as empowered actors, say that, like, yeah, it's cool that you guys can disable the 24-hour thing, and go ahead, deploy this fix, and then do disclosure afterwards. There's various levels of trust that we can get into. The question is, how do we make that mechanism work, and how do we trust the people that we're supposed to trust, and all the rest of it. So it's a tough conversation.
Also, let's keep in mind that right now, there's not a lot of people with the technical capabilities to do that. So right now it is, the Maker Foundation Smart Contracts team. We have seen other teams slowly get more knowledge of, single collateral DAI, multi-collateral DAI. You have the InstaDApp kids who built one of the first integrations, and now they have some fair understanding. I don't know if they have time for that yet, but what you said, like, not decentralization, but trust. I think that right now the community trusts the Maker Foundation engineering team to do what is best for the system, which is something that has to be considered when, if we eventually say, hey, there is some issue here that needs to be fixed, and maybe it needs to be fixed quickly. And I know that's not quantifiable. It lies within a spectrum, as you say.
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, it's a good point to make, though. Like, the foundation exists in order to shepherd and promote and secure this protocol until we can dissolve ourselves and hand it off to the community. That's like literally the reason why we exist, is to secure this thing. So presumably from that model, we should be trusted implicitly. That's not the world we live in. So there's definitely discussions that can be had, though, about how do we come up with that process. So that there's something bad has happened to the system. We need to have an emergency response team and outside actors. So there's precedents in this world. Like, it's already happened in the past. HackerOne has all kinds of processes for these types of things. If people come to us with a responsible disclosure of an issue, we can form a group to talk about that, involve the community, discuss what this thing is, come up with a plan for suspending the GSM, implementing that fix, and then communicating effectively afterwards. There's the potential to come up with a good process that most of us, if not all of us, can live with, is there. We just need to have these conversations and try to avoid getting blindsided as much as possible. Did you
I just
have?
wanted to echo what I said
go
in,
ahead.
in response to Mariano. Just that I totally agree with what you're saying, but I also think it would be counterintuitive to me to think that new decisions and new things that we're putting in place to protect DAI should increase the amount of trust or increase the amount of what you're talking about. It seems like every new decision should be in the other direction. You know, I feel like taking a step back, unless we want to kind of look at it as one step forward or two steps forward, one step back, you know, type thing. But like, you know, that should be better thought through. So I think any solution that's going to increase the amount of trust that we have to have in the foundation is going to be pretty tough to swallow.
Chris, I can tell you all the discussions that we have internally come down to trying to think about the foundation adversarially. So we do push for that decentralization internally. This particular problem of how to patch stuff, no one has an elegant solution yet. It's the one sort of place in the space where I don't think anyone has found a good trustless way to do patches, let alone security disclosures. You know, the entire process of how you handle a responsible disclosure, vet that, and then push a fix. It relies in the old paradigm completely on trust. And but aside from that, I think all of us agree with the sentiment that in fact, I think the mission of the foundation is to move us towards a world where the foundation doesn't have that sort of trust relationship anymore.
This trustlessness is an entirely new area of research. I mean, we have a problem, we need to solve it, and it seems like we need to use the tools that we know we have to solve it, and then research how we can get to that trustless solution going forward.
Yeah, I would also like to distinguish between like long-term average and temporary measures. So I agree that the long-term, and that's the whole point of gradual decentralization, that in the long term we do move systematically in the direction of more decentralization. But in the case of when you have that situation where there is a critical vulnerability, to then temporarily fall back to a slightly more trusted version or a slightly more trusted model. I mean, if there is a better alternative, then sure, by all means go by the better alternative. But if this is the best we got, I don't think we should see it as but like this is not a systematic revert to more trust-based system. It's just it's an operation, right? It's you carry out an operation which granted does require more trust at that very moment, but then immediately after that the delay is increased again, and you're back to your trustless world, or your more trustless world. So I think we should separate between those two, like the general direction we're moving in, and these temporary emergency situations, and there will be those, right? So we need to have a way to handle those.
All right, it's awkward silence time, so I'm going to jump in and attempt to desperately fill that silence. We're 10 minutes into the turn of the hour, and we still haven't gotten to the monetary policy stuff and or the risk status, migration status. So we have some decisions we got to make.
If there are any more questions for the engineering team, because otherwise we need to go and
things to do.
Everything that we discussed for
get back to work. Break's over. All right.
I actually have a question, a quick one. I'm sure you guys already think through this, but quantifying what is critical or not, is that in some senses open, or is that mostly an internal process?
That's a great question.
Well, if
it's
we
what's
go
both,
by,
right? There's no bright line.
I mean, well, do you want to go by?
Yeah, that's what I figured.
The bounties. That's a fairly
Yeah, the bug bounty is indeed a good example where it's quite well defined. Now, risk analysis is always, it's 50% science, it's 50% art, and then ultimately it depends on your risk appetite. So unfortunately, it's not possible to have this end-to-end scientific model that gives you the exact right optimal solution. How the development team carries out their risk analyses and how certain patches and updates are categorized, I think we should work towards an objective scoring model where we quantify how critical a certain patch is supposed to be. But the hard part there is to actually work out that model. So I think it's an excellent point. We need to think about what kind of categories we want to distinguish between, and then we can use that model to refer to in the future. So I think that would be a very good idea.
All right, so I don't want to leave it there because there's things that still need to be talked about. So I talked about the process and figuring out what consensus means and what cadence works for us and all the rest of it. But here's another great topic of research: is how should the foundation manage these types of updates? How do we minimize the level of trust that's required? That's an interesting area that needs to be explored in this brave new world of decentralization that we have ahead of us. My assumption is that somehow ZK snarks will magically save us. That's the new bucket of hope that I trust everything into, but who knows? If anybody has ideas about policies or processes or empowered actors or anything, please let us know what it is in the forums and we'll get a long-term discussion happening. We need to come up with something, and so there's room to come up with some innovative solution too. Vishesh or Cyrus, I'll hand it up to you, and you can figure out who's going to talk next.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I'll do a quick thing. Just give me 1 second to the screen share up. Okay, I'm really going to run through this as quickly as I can because of the time situation. Okay, so let's see. DAI supply is at 61 million, and the ETH locked in MCD is 1.2 million. On single collateral, it is 51 million and about 900,000 ETH. So we did see a bit of a flippening from SAI to DAI, both in terms of the supply and the amount of collateral locked, which is pretty cool to see. I think to achieve this, what has it only been like 3 weeks or so, 3 or 4 weeks. I think it's a pretty good success milestone. The total supply is now up to about 112 or 13 million, which is about 10 to 12 million higher than when MCD launched. The DSR utilization rate is up to 25%, which is a pretty big jump from last week where it was, I think, hovering around 15%. The higher DSR rate certainly played a part there. We're not really seeing much upward pressure in the DAI price. And I'll let Vishesh talk about the price stuff, but just it seems like maybe the outside capital, which is what is needed to push the DAI price upwards as a result of the DSR, just isn't sensitive to these small changes, 1 or 2%. We saw something similar with the stability fee earlier this summer, where just the borrower sensitivity was just not enough compared to the amount of the rate change. So it'll be interesting to see what the sensitivity to the DSR is in the coming weeks and months. One potential reason is this: maybe the barriers to acquiring DAI are too significant. It's not really the easiest thing to go from USD to DAI, especially on a global scale where not everybody has access to all the same exchanges. Eventually, it should play out as intended. Just want to highlight that the DSR utilization in and of itself doesn't push the DAI price up. What's really needed is for investors to convert outside capital into DAI to push the price up. So that makes the DSR utilization a bit murky in terms of trying to track its efficacy on the DAI price. In theory, it shouldn't have an impact on the DAI price. Practically speaking, I would say that the higher the DSR utilization is, it's just generally less circulating supply or less float in the markets. So this is going to probably be a recurring theme as we try to wrangle the DSR utilization and the DSR rate versus the DAI price. Moving on, the DAI and Uniswap liquidity has surpassed the Psi liquidity as well, which is interesting. Kind of a big thing that I noticed this week was that the DAI in the migration contract is not being scooped up as quickly as it was in the first few weeks. I think a few days ago we saw about 1 or 2 million just sitting there for a period of 24 hours. What this means is that Psi migrators are no longer the bottleneck for migration, and it's now flipped back to CDP owners are the bottleneck. And this kind of back and forth between Psi owners and CDP owners could likely happen multiple times. And basically, we need to maybe start to think about incentives for CDP owners instead of Psi holders. So last week, when we were trying to target Psi holders, we ended up with a negative SCD stability fee to DSR spread, where is technically a very small arb to mint Psi and convert it and migrate it and put it into the DSR. There's some varying opinions on how effective that was. Personally, I thought it was somewhat effective. I was able to at least kind of see one market maker mint about, I think, 1 million Psi and put about half of that into the DSR. So I know it's having some effect, but maybe not much. Also, it's kind of hard to tell because the arbitrage opportunity was extremely small. That being said, Psi migration is no longer really the bottleneck. So if we wanted to target CDP owners, there's a couple ways to do this, kind of up to the community on how they want to proceed. But I think kind of the two most straightforward ones are, one is to increase the SCD stability fee, and the other is to decrease the MCD stability fee. So kind of call this the stick and the carrot. If you want to make it more frustrating for single collateral owners to stay on SCD, or you want to make it more appealing to them for them to switch over to MCD. Kind of just two different ways to play it. If we do go with making it more appealing to switch over by lowering the MCD stability fee, we have to be very conscious of the DAI price, which is it's kind of okay right now at about $1, but I know it's looking a little bit weak earlier this week. So any decreases in the stability fee there would logically be accompanied with a larger increase in the DSR, and how large is difficult to say because we don't really know the sensitivity there. If we were to increase the single collateral stability fee, I mean, just kind of goes back to the recurring theme of sell side Psi liquidity, and that could pose problems down the line. So yeah, that's probably a discussion we could have later in the forums. Couple final points. One is just about Compound. So Compound still has about 12 million Psi in there, 9 million of which is utilized. One thing that we were thinking that a bunch of those suppliers have maybe borrowed other tokens from Compound, meaning that the spread between the Compound rate and the DSR isn't really relevant because that's not the product or the feature they're going for. And Compound DAI, as far as I understand, you're not able to borrow against DAI that you've supplied. So they really couldn't migrate to the Compound DAI either, although I think that should be launching soon from what I've heard. So it seems like there might still be few more roadblocks to getting the Compound side to migrate over. Yeah, that's about it for me. I know those a lot. Maybe just jump to questions or maybe have Vishesh do his thing. All right, then were there any questions in the chat?
Didn't see any, no.
Okay, cool.
Cyrus, I got a question. Hey. You're saying that the so the number is like right now, like creating those incentives for the remaining CDP holders that are apparently the majority there that are still to migrate from SAI to DAI. Do you have like any idea in terms of like numbers of like big CDP holders there are still? I think you presented something like in the last chat last week, I think, about some numbers of big, some addresses with some big holders and how that actually stands compared to last week.
Yeah, there's certainly a fair amount of chain analysis work to be done here. Wasn't able to really get to too much of it this last week because things were a bit busy. But in any case, I mean, I think if we're going to go down that granular approach of starting to like really dive deep into the distribution of remaining CDP holders and remaining SAI holders, it's going to be like a much longer process. Not really something that that's kind of I mean, the way I see it is kind of like a medium-term project, not something that we can really get into too deep on a week-to-week basis right now. But trying to get something going. And I mean, for like in the short term, there are a few websites out there that show top CDP holders, such as I think MakerScan is one. There's a few others as well. So I mean, just kind of as a quick glance, we can see those statistics. Maybe it's just a bit hard to kind of analyze them too deeply or interpret too much from them. All right, Vishesh, you're on.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, Cyrus covered a lot of it, so I won't go too long. But yeah, I mean, just a quick touch on. So SAI, we saw, large quantities of wipes, about 10 days ago, and then that's sort of fallen slowly since then to just hovering around 60 million. Whereas DAI, we sort of saw that come right back up. So, not going to repeat some of the migration stuff, but that is progressing. As far as prices, so there's been, I would say, comparatively low, I'll just reload this, comparatively low trading volume in the last 24 hours. Obviously, SAI, there's not a lot of places where it's trading anymore. So, and then just to note, in case anybody was curious about the Oasis trades, since ETHDAI did stop facilitating on their UI these trades. Seems like these are direct on contract trades, which obviously they can't stop. So yeah, I mean, by and large, trading around $1. It was trading slightly above for a short period, and then since then is traded, more or less at. So on average, It's just slightly above. Yeah, very light trading, but you know, peg for both technically seems to be holding fine. I think the interest rates do play a role in terms of like how these assets have been trading lately. So that's something interesting to look at. Obviously, most of DAI currently is from ETH, small amount from BAT as well, but I think we're mainly, for the purpose of looking at this, focused on the ETH supply there. It's interesting, with more collateral assets, we'll have to have more fragmented conversations about what's going on. So that's just an interesting question on how we manage those conversations. But yeah, I mean, so ETH stability fee is higher than what's currently been going on Compound. So for multi-collateral DAI, it's cheaper to borrow on Compound than it is to mint new MCD from Maker. So theoretically, this should be incentivizing a growth in this borrow volume, which should further be incentivizing a growth in the borrow rate, and that's you know, theoretically should close the gap between what's going on here and the stability fee. As far as supply, so it's pretty interesting. The borrow volume for single collateral DAI obviously has come down, you know, significantly, and the supply volume has also come down significantly. But more interestingly, the utilization is just cratered in terms of single collateral DAI on Compound. So there is just a pool of single collateral DAI, about 9 million that's just 9-10 million that's just sitting there on Compound, collecting a very low supply rate. So that appears to be the dredges of the bucket. I think it'll be the slowest thing to empty out of migration. Curious why that is so sticky, but maybe it's just some hesitancy to trust a new system, even though there's theoretically a better yield on the DSR right now. So that's an interesting point to consider, because, you know, what had happened previously was the DSR rate at this 4% was not quite enough to necessarily justify that switch over, but now it's a higher rate, so there really is no good reason for that volume to just be sitting there. And it's a pretty significant volume, so that's something that's interesting to watch. But yeah, as far as MCD, I mean, 14 million-ish being offered on Compound, and about 8 million of that taken up. That's fairly decent utilization. So it will be interesting to continue to watch as this number grows compared to, or, you know, as a fraction of the 70 million MCD that is out there, because that's a what is that, roughly 1/5? Yeah, 1/5. That's pretty significant percentage of the total supply being offered on Compound. I think for MCD, or for SCD prior, you know, we saw that hitting around 30% when it was pretty high. So, you know, all said and done, this should proportionately rise as the MCD supply rises and migration finishes out. But again, these like rate and volume differentials are very interesting to watch, because it's kind of a multi-part complicated system that currently exists as Maker sort of straddles the switch over from Psi to DAI. But yeah, so far everything seems to be proceeding accordingly there, with the exception of this just, you know, weird persistence of the Psi supply on Compound. Yeah, so I think actually a lot of the other stuff was already covered by Cyrus. Just one note was on a weighted average basis, so I ran some numbers, the relative collateralization of MCD vaults is about 300%. So that's a pretty mid to high collateralization ratio. So I thought it would just be good to sort of check on the risk that persists in MCD vaults currently, since it's been a while since we checked on that, and it would be interesting to see if there was a significant change in the collateralization of SCD versus MCD. But given that there was about a million ETH for SCD collateral at say 143 was the current price, so 143 million bucks, collateralizing about 60 million Psi is a roughly similar, slightly lower collateralization. So MCD's got a slightly higher collateralization at the moment, if my scratch math is right. So yeah, I mean, the new system seems to be working pretty well. I'll open up to questions as well, if anybody has. Chris is probably commenting on the percentage of the total size supply that was generally lent out on Compound. You're right. It's probably was closer to 25% than 30. No,
I'm
different
actually
thing.
pretty sure that was your battery, Vishesh.
Yeah, he was definitely talking about your battery.
That's really funny. Okay, I thought it was a real point. My bad.
There was a so
Don't worry,
Aaron and me were saying like again having a 7-day
yeah, so any questions? Otherwise, I can just hand it back.
I think we're more concerned about your internal human battery at this point. What can we do to help, man?
Damn.
Maybe some Herbalife and some Red Bulls or something. Gotta perk you up. All right, thanks, man. That was really cool. It was informative. All right, Cyrus is gone, so nobody's in control of risk right now, so we'll use the reins. If there's questions, please ask. Clock's ticking, though. We're over an hour and a half in, so that was a lot to digest for one day. So in the absence of any burning questions at the last minute, I think we're going to bring this thing to a close. Please join us in the forum. So I'm going to keep on saying that until people say it for me. Governance happens in the forums. There's lots of things going on right there. We need to figure out what all that stuff is and how it all works together and what the processes are and what works for this community that we have here. So please join us as we develop governance version 2. All right, thanks everybody.
Y'all are great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I saw that there was good views on your video, Chris. I'm really glad to see that. It was super short and sweet, so that was good.
Yeah, it was great. I think that you
Very
should do
informative.
those on a daily basis at this point. So thanks for that.
Nah, but you
This is the
captured it.
first
You captured
time-
it well.
Yeah, this is the first time for me to join Makers Meetup. This is really good, awesome.
Thanks for being here, man. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, I will keep joining.
Right on. All right, I'm going to hit the big red button. Thanks, everybody.